Arrested without reason. His hidden identity leaves police frozen rain, pressed against the city like a heavy hand, and the streetlights trembled inside their wet halos while Daniel Cole walked with a steady pace past a shuttered store that had gone dark an hour earlier. His jacket damp at the shoulders and his collar turned up against the wind. He looked like any quiet man cutting across a block to get home before the night turned colder. He kept his hands visible and his steps even because that was his habit. He moved like a person who understood that calm is not only a feeling, but also a shape your body can make. And he knew how to hold that shape even when the world felt loud and careless. A patrol car rolled to the curb and the wipers clacked in a harsh rhythm as two officers stepped out. One tall and impatient with a jaw that held tension like a clamp, and the other younger with eyes that tried to see more than the rain would let her see. They told Daniel to stop, and he stopped. They asked where he was going, and he answered in a low, clear voice that carried a simple truth about a bus line and a short walk, and a key in his pocket. The tall officer said the store had an alarm last week, and that break-ins ran through this area like fever. He said it would be quick to make sure nothing was wrong. Daniel nodded because he had learned that nodding can be a bridge and a shield at the same time. The search was clumsy in the downpour, and the officer's flashlight shook across Daniel's side like a narrow storm. There was a wallet and a folded note and a small pen with no logo, and that was all. Nothing sharp, nothing stolen, nothing strange. Still, the tall officer felt the pull of a long shift and a need to prove something to the watch commander, and he called in a code and snapped cold cuffs around Daniel's wrists. The younger officer flinched at the sound because it came too fast and too final. For a street that was almost empty, she glanced at Daniel and he offered her a look that was not a plea and not a challenge. It was the kind of look that said, "I will not make your night harder, and I will not lie to you either." They loaded him into the back and the rain turned from a sheet to a fine mist that looked like smoke in the red and blue wash of the lights. The precinct smelled like coffee burned thin over hours, and the floor held a slick map of footprints that led from the door to the booking desk. Daniel stood straight with his hands behind him and his shoulders set the way a person sets a picture frame against a wall that is not quite level. The desk clerk asked his name and he said Daniel Cole in the same steady tone, and then he added that he would like his one call as soon as it was allowed. The sergeant at the corner table looked up from a stack of reports and saw a quiet man who did not look afraid. And this annoyed him because fear made people easy to sort and easy to file. He told the clerk to finish the intake first, then ride the paperwork down to holding. The tall arresting officer spoke about suspicious movement, about a bulge that did not exist, about a store that looked as if it wanted to be broken into. The younger officer named Maya stood a step back and watched the small details that many people never see. The way Daniel's breath stayed slow, the way his gaze never cut at sharp angles, the way he made space for other bodies in a crowded room without being told. It was the stance of someone who knew pressure the way a diver knows water. And even when you know water, it can drown you if you forget to respect it. Maya felt a pinch of doubt, because the story her partner told had rough edges that did not match the smooth grain of what she had just witnessed on the sidewalk. She asked to pull the body cam footage for review, and her partner waved it off with a tired smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "No need. We got this one in the bag." She did not like that phrase because a person is not a thing and a life is not a prize. She reached for the terminal anyway. Daniel asked once more for his call, and the clerk hesitated because the name he had written on the intake form looked ordinary. But the way he had written it looked practiced. You could tell when a hand had been trained to place letters with care. The sergeant decided to make him wait and said, "We will get to it when we get to it. Small mistakes are like small leaks, and a station can sink from them even if the hull looks strong." The room carried the mood of a late hour where people want to be right more than they want to be careful. Maya logged in and found the file tree for the body cam clips and saw a flag that said, "Auto sync pending." She glanced through the glass toward the holding bench where Daniel sat very still, not stiff but still like a mountain lake before dawn. She felt again that quiet pinch and she followed it because some doubts come from fear, but other doubts come from duty. And the only way to know which kind you have is to listen and then move. They processed Daniel's property and placed a small gray tray on the shelf with his wallet and his pen and the folded note. The clerk asked if there were medical issues or needs, and Daniel said only that he had to make his call and that it would help everyone if it happened soon. The sergeant snorted because he thought the man was bluffing. People say many things at the desk in the last hour before midnight, and most of it turns to air. But Daniel did not throw words like dice, he laid them like stones, one after another to make a path that looked simple until you tried to step off it. Maya walked to the locker hall to check on the upload and passed a bulletin board covered with memos and grief. The city had been heavy this season. Budgets cut thin, tempers short. A widow's fund jar with a paper label sat by the coffee maker and the lid had been twisted down hard. She twisted it back and dropped in a few coins without thinking. Then she stopped because her eye caught the corner of a printed flyer for the youth center on Jackson Avenue. There was a line about an anonymous donor who kept the doors open on weekends. It meant nothing for the case, she told herself. It meant everything for the city. She went back to the terminal and watched the buffer crawl across the screen like a slow worm in the holding cell. Daniel sat on the bench and breathed in the stale air that smelled of rain and rubber and old heat. He kept his back from touching the wall because cold can travel from a wall into your bones and take root there. A drunk 2 cells down muttered a song and fell asleep between one word and the next. A clock above the desk ticked in tired steps and each step echoed off the tile. Daniel counted not to pass time but to measure it. He was trained to measure because timing can save a life in ways that a louder skill cannot. The sergeant came by again and asked a few short questions as if to check whether Daniel would change his answers like a weather vane. Daniel did not, and the sergeant walked away with a frown that tried to keep its pride. Maya returned to the desk and the tall officer gave her a look that said, "Drop it and get the forms done." She said she would finish the forms after the footage review and the air cooled a degree. Outside the storm softened to a whisper, and the city stretched like a long animal after a run. Buses hissed at the curb. A diner light came back on. A siren far away rose and fell like a tired lullaby. Inside the station, the small leaks kept leaking. An intake time got rounded up. A line on the arrest sheet was filled with a guess. A checkbox was ticked without thought. Daniel watched people move through these choices like they were walking across a room, full of rugs that hid holes in the floor. He did not hate them for it. He only marked the holes in his mind and waited for the moment he could tell someone where not to step. He thought of the folded note in his tray, and the simple name written there, and he hoped he would not need to use it, because to use it would tilt the quiet balance he had tried to keep around his life like a shelter. Maya finally pulled up the partial clip and saw rain sliding down the lens like tears that refused to fall. She saw Daniel's hands open and still. She heard his voice steady and respectful. She saw her partner's shoulders tight in a way that had nothing to do with threat, and everything to do with a long shift and a longer pride. The clip ended before the cuff snapped shut because the battery dipped right at the curb. She saved the file and began the request for the dash camera, which might have the missing seconds. She looked over at Daniel and he met her eyes with a small nod. The kind you give to someone who is fighting the right fight, even if it is a quiet one. She walked to the sergeant and said the call should happen now. The sergeant waved her off and reached for his pen. The clock stepped forward again, and the night held its breath as if the next breath would decide whether this was only another arrest that would fade by morning, or the first step of a story that would test every person in the room and show each of them who they were. When the rain finally stopped, the station felt heavier as the hour pushed closer to midnight, and the walls held the kind of silence that grows when people pretend everything is fine even though something inside the room keeps whispering that it is not. Daniel sat in the holding cell with the same quiet posture he carried outside in the rain. His hands rested calmly on his knees and his eyes studied the floor as if he were reading patterns hidden in the lines of the old tiles. The other cells were mostly empty except for a sleeping drunk and a man mumbling to himself. But even their sounds seemed to fade when Daniel breathed in and out, with that slow, steady rhythm that made Maya feel like she was watching someone trained to stay balanced in situations that usually break people. The desk clerk finished typing up the last lines of the intake sheet and pushed the papers toward the sergeant, who skimmed them with the bored confidence of someone convinced that patterns are always predictable, and people are always the same. He barely looked up as he ordered the clerk to move Daniel to the booking room for prints and photos, even though they had not confirmed probable cause in any clean way. Maya stood nearby trying to gather the courage to challenge the arrest before it hardened into an official mistake. But her partner stayed glued to her shoulder, like a shadow that would not let her step into the light inside the booking room. The fluorescent lamps hummed like tired bees and Daniel stood against the blank gray wall as the camera clicked. The flash washed over him and reflected off his damp jacket as if trying to scrape some shine off an ordinary man, but nothing about him looked shaken. His calm was not the calm of arrogance or indifference. It was the calm of someone who understood storms and had walked through enough of them to know when to bend and when to plant his feet. The tall officer handled the process roughly. snapping the fingerprint scanner onto the table and rolling Daniel's fingers harder than necessary. Maya watched the scanner window and noticed something strange. The machine paused and blinked twice before the results moved forward, as if the system had to think longer than usual to decide what it was seeing. The screen showed a partial match pending verification, and then shifted into a delay window that she had never seen before. The tall officer shrugged it off and said, "These machines glitch all the time, especially when the weather is ugly." But Maya's instincts told her that glitches do not breathe with intention. The way this paused did Daniel ask softly again for his phone call. His voice calm but carrying a weight that made Maya look up. The sergeant had entered the room at that moment and rolled his eyes before saying they would get to it when the computers caught up. He walked out without waiting for a response because he assumed the room would bend around his decisions the same way the night bent around the rain. Maya shifted uncomfortably and tried to ask Daniel if he needed medical attention or water. But before she finished, her partner cut her off and said, "Stop worrying. He is fine. We deal with tougher guys every weekend." Daniel watched that exchange with a quiet expression that held neither annoyance nor fear, only a kind of tired understanding that told Maya he had seen this sort of attitude before, maybe too many times. They led Daniel back to the holding cell and locked the door with a metallic clank that echoed down the hallway. The clerk returned to the front desk and the sergeant told him to start prepping the initial charge form, even though the evidence was thin enough to crumble under a strong breath. Maya tried again to look at the body cam footage, but the upload stalled at 90%, and the circle spun like a restless eye. She tapped her foot while waiting, and the tall officer leaned over her shoulder and said, "Leave it for morning." She straightened her back and said, "Footage does not care about morning. A lie tonight is still a lie tomorrow." Her partner muttered something under his breath and walked away, annoyed that she would rather follow truth than follow his lead. Maya clenched her jaw because she knew that small cracks in trust can turn into wide fractures if no one seals them early. In the cell, Daniel leaned his head back against the cold bars and examined the room not with fear but with calculation. He made a habit of studying every space he entered, even the ones he never wanted to enter. Because knowledge is a kind of shield, and paying attention is a kind of armor. He listened to the distant clatter of keys and the low murmur of officers swapping stories over paperwork. He counted how many steps each sound took to travel from the hallway to his cell, and he timed each noise with the tick of the wall clock across from him. Time mattered here more than he wanted it to, but he stayed still and waited for the right window. The folded note in the property tray weighed on his mind, and he hoped they would let him use it before something went wrong. Inside the station that could not be, undone with apologies or explanations. The storm outside faded into a thin drizzle that painted the windows with a soft smear of streetlight. The quiet felt thick inside the building, and the officers who had been loud earlier now moved with slower steps. The watch commander appeared from his office with a fresh cup of coffee and asked for updates on the break-in cases from the week before. The tall officer quickly plugged Daniel into the narrative as a possible suspect because it made his arrest sound important. The commander wanted a quick win, and the thought of clearing a case made his eyes brighten just enough to ignore the loose ends. He told them to process paperwork fast and hold Daniel for questioning until morning. Maya felt her chest tighten because she hated how easily half-truths could slide into official forms and trap someone who had done nothing wrong. She wanted to speak up, but she needed proof, not just a feeling. She clicked the footage link again, and the upload jumped finally to completion. At that moment, the station lights flickered, a quick pulse like a heartbeat hitting the wrong rhythm. The phone lines reset with a mechanical beep, and Daniel lifted his head because timing had just opened a door for him. Maya saw the phones reboot and hurried to the clerk, because protocol said calls could be made once the system was active again. She asked if Daniel could have his call now, and the clerk nodded because the sergeant was busy arguing with the commander over something unrelated. She hurried to the cell and unlocked the door to escort Daniel to the phone. The tall officer gave her a questioning look, and she met it with a steady gaze that said she was following procedure and he could either accept that or file a complaint later. Daniel stepped into the small phone booth area with quiet grace. He took the receiver and dialed a number from memory, a number he had hoped he would never need but always kept ready. He spoke only a few words in a calm, low tone, words that did not sound like a plea for help, but more like a signal being sent to someone who already understood the stakes of silence and timing. Maya watched him and felt the air in the room shift slightly as if something invisible had just stepped closer. Daniel hung up the phone and thanked her with that same steady voice that never cracked under pressure. She nodded, but her heart was beating faster, even though she did not know why. Minutes later, the main station line rang sharply, and the clerk answered casually. His relaxed posture stiffened as soon as he heard the voice on the other end. The caller identified themselves from a federal switchboard and asked for details regarding a detainee named Daniel Cole. The clerk stammered and called for the watch commander, who took the phone with an impatient huff. He listened for 5 seconds, then snorted and hung up, muttering that prank callers get more creative every year. Maya felt a chill because she saw the federal switchboard number flash in the caller ID log, and numbers like that do not prank stations at midnight for fun. She glanced at Daniel and he looked at the clock again as if the hands were telling him a story, in a language only he understood. He spoke quietly to Maya and said sometimes the next few minutes matter more than the next few hours. His tone held no drama, only truth, and that truth slid into her mind like a slow bright spark that warned her something big was already moving toward the station, something that might lift all the small mistakes they had made tonight and turn them into consequences no one in the room was ready for. She felt the floor steady under her feet, and for the first time, she sensed that this quiet man was not who her partner thought he was, not who the sergeant assumed he was, and not who the commander wanted him to be. Maya realized the real story had not started with the arrest. It was starting now, in these minutes. In this silence, in the weight of a phone call that refused to be ignored, and in the calm breath of a man who seemed to know exactly what storm was about to walk through the station doors and change. Everything around them, the station, moved through a strange tension, as if every sound in the building had gained its own heartbeat and every breath carried a weight that no one could explain yet. Daniel sat quietly on the bench outside the phone booth, and his calm presence felt even stronger now. Not louder but deeper, like the calm before a tide rises. Maya stood nearby with her arms folded and her mind racing as she tried to piece together the pattern hidden inside the last few minutes. The federal switchboard call kept echoing in her thoughts because calls like that do not come to small precincts unless something serious is already unfolding behind the scenes. The watch commander pretended everything was normal, but his hands trembled slightly when he picked up his coffee cup, and that tremble told Maya more truth than his words ever could. A small hum rippled across the ceiling, lights as the electrical system tried to settle after the power flicker, and the air conditioner clicked off for a moment, leaving the room warmer and heavier. The tall officer paced by the lockers, pretending to be annoyed about paperwork delays, but Maya saw him avoiding eye contact, because deep down, he felt something was wrong too. People always pretend they are not afraid until fear lands directly in front of them with quiet feet. Daniel waited with the patience of someone counting invisible steps in his head, and Maya wondered if he already knew what was coming next, or if he simply trusted timing the way some people trust prayer. The clock above the desk ticked forward with long, slow clicks, and those clicks felt like a countdown, though no one knew to what. The sergeant returned from the commander's office looking irritated and restless. He barked at the clerk to finish the initial report and told Maya to stop hovering around the holding area like she was guarding a treasure. She ignored the jab and kept her focus on Daniel, because her instincts told her that nothing about this man or this arrest was ordinary. She remembered the strange pause in the fingerprint machine, the sealed feeling of the body cam footage, the federal call, the calm in Daniel's eyes, and all those pieces lined up inside her like a quiet warning. She walked to the desk to review the logs again, and noticed something else that made her breath catch. The call attempt from the federal line had repeated twice and then stopped, as if someone on the other end was waiting for the station to make the next move. Daniel raised his head slightly and looked toward the entrance doors, not because he heard something but because he felt something. His awareness seemed to stretch beyond the walls, and Maya understood then that this was a man used to reading rooms in ways people never teach. He stood not abruptly but with soft precision, as if preparing himself for an arrival that had not happened yet. Maya moved closer and asked quietly if the call he made earlier was supposed to reach someone specific. He nodded slowly and said the person on the other end always answers and always acts fast, and if they have not arrived already, it means they are on their way here right now. His tone did not carry fear or pride, only certainty, the kind of certainty that grows from experience, not guesswork. The front door suddenly pushed open and a gust of wet, cold air rushed into the lobby. Not dramatic, but firm enough to make the sergeant flinch. 2 civilians walked in with umbrellas dripping rainwater, and the officers relaxed again. Maya exhaled softly, relieved and embarrassed for feeling alarmed over nothing. The civilians filed a noise complaint and left quickly, and the station returned to its tense stillness. But Daniel had not sat down again, and that made Maya uneasy. She asked him if something was wrong, and he replied that the timing was close now, and that sometimes storms send soft warnings before the real strike arrives. She asked what kind of strike he meant, but he did not answer directly. He simply said the next person who walks through those doors will not be here for noise complaints. A few minutes later, as if guided by his words, the phone at the front desk rang again. The clerk answered, and his expression changed instantly into confusion and a hint of fear. He looked at the watch commander with wide eyes and said the caller was asking for immediate access to the precinct. The commander grabbed the phone with annoyance, ready to snap at whoever was calling. But as soon as he heard the voice, his face drained of color. He straightened his back, cleared his throat, and then replied in a very different tone, one that tried to sound confident, but cracked slightly at the edges. The room went quiet as the commander listened carefully. He nodded again and then slowly hung up the phone like someone lowering a fragile object onto a shelf. Before anyone could speak, the entrance doors opened once more, and this time it was not civilians stepping inside. 2 men in dark suits walked in with steady, deliberate steps, not rushing, not hesitating. Their shoes left small wet prints on the tile, and their eyes moved across the room like scanners recording every detail. The tall officer instinctively stepped forward to question them, but one of the men raised a badge wallet without breaking stride, and the badge shone with a seal that froze the entire room. The watch commander hurried forward with a forced smile and asked how he could help. The taller-suited man spoke in a calm, firm voice requesting immediate access to a detainee, named Daniel Cole, and the moment he said that name, Maya felt her breath stop for a second, because the tone he used was not the tone of someone looking for a suspect. It was the tone of someone protecting an asset. The sergeant swallowed hard because he realized the arrest report sitting half-finished on his desk suddenly felt like a lit fuse. The tall officer stepped aside with stiff shoulders because whatever pride he had built around this arrest was dissolving fast. Maya moved instinctively toward Daniel, feeling some responsibility for keeping him safe, even though she still did not fully understand why he needed protection. Daniel stepped out from the holding area with a calm posture that matched the suits in the doorway, and he looked at them with recognition, not surprise. The shorter-suited man asked for privacy with the commander, and they moved to the office, leaving the rest of the station in a thick, silent pressure. Maya walked to Daniel and whispered if he was in danger. He replied gently that danger is a wide word, and tonight it might belong to the wrong people if things were not handled carefully. She felt her pulse pick up because his voice carried no threat, yet the meaning behind it was sharp enough to cut through the uncertainty hanging in the air. She wanted to ask him who he really was, but the question felt too large for the moment. The commander's office door closed and the blinds shifted as silhouettes moved inside. The suits spoke quietly, but their words carried weight even through the glass. Maya could not hear details, but she caught fragments, and those fragments made her skin prickle. Protected witness, sealed identity, operational risks, need to correct immediate procedural error. The words landed like stones inside her chest, one after another, forming a shape that pointed toward only one truth. Daniel was not just a quiet man caught in a wrong stop. He was something more, something protected, something hidden. Daniel sat down again on the bench, breathing steadily while the rest of the room held its breath. The storm outside had weakened to a soft drizzle, but inside the storm that mattered was gathering strength with every ticking second. Maya looked around at her fellow officers and saw worry blooming across their faces because they understood too late that a simple arrest had grown into a situation far larger than any of them had been ready for. She turned back to Daniel and saw that his calm had not shifted at all. His steady presence felt like the only stable anchor left in the room. She sat beside him without speaking, and he nodded once in quiet acknowledgement, as if telling her that she was right where she needed to be for what was coming next. The blinds in the commander's office trembled slightly each time a voice inside rose, then softened again, and the rest of the station felt like it was holding its breath, watching shadows slip back and forth across the frosted glass while the storm outside whispered against the windows. Daniel sat calmly on the bench with his hands resting loosely in his lap, and Maya stood beside him, trying to understand how a simple arrest had turned into something that made even senior officers look like they were walking on thin ice. Every second felt stretched, as if time itself wanted to reveal something, but kept pausing at the edge. The tall officer leaned against the lockers, pretending to be relaxed, but the way his fingers tapped against the metal showed he knew trouble was coming. The sergeant kept pacing in slow, stiff circles because the suits had arrived without warning, and when suits arrive unannounced in the middle of the night, it means the ground beneath every careless decision begins to shake. Maya tried to hear what was being said behind the closed door, but only pieces drifted out like broken fragments of a truth. They were not yet allowed to hold inside that office. The two suited men were standing firm while the commander tried to maintain his authority. They laid documents across the desk and pointed to a page stamped with markings Maya had never seen in person, but she recognized them from training. Markings that meant sealed files, protected witnesses, security clearance that sat far above anything a local precinct could access. The commander's tone shifted from defensive to confused to uneasy as the suits explained that Daniel was not to be held here, not to be questioned, not to be recorded in any public log, because his identity was part of an ongoing joint operation that depended on absolute confidentiality. They mentioned risk assessments, possible exposure, and the need for immediate correction of procedural errors. The commander tried to argue that the arresting officer had suspicion and that protocol allowed temporary detainment, but one of the suits slid another document forward and his voice remained steady as he said, "Suspicion without evidence becomes misconduct when it interferes with federal movements." The commander swallowed hard at that and his face changed from stern to pale. Meanwhile, Maya stood outside the office feeling the tension radiating through the walls. She kept glancing at Daniel, who stayed silent and calm, as if he had expected every part of this night to unfold just like this. She leaned closer to him and asked softly how he knew the suits would come. He replied gently that the call he made always activates a chain, and that chain does not break no matter the hour, no matter the weather. His voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from living a life built around hidden truths and quiet sacrifices, and it made her realize he had been moving through the night with purpose even when everyone else thought he was just another man caught in bad luck. The door to the commander's office opened sharply, and the suits stepped back into the main room, their expressions unreadable, but their posture clear as steel. The commander followed behind them with a stiff nod and told everyone to stand by. The taller suited man turned to Maya and asked if she had been present at the arrest. She nodded and the man studied her for a moment before asking if she had recorded the interaction. She explained that the body cam footage was partial because of the rain and a battery dip, but the dash cam should hold the rest once synced. The suit nodded with approval and said, "Keep it secured, we need every second of it." The tall officer shifted uncomfortably, knowing his actions would soon lie exposed in the glowing frame of the dashcam lens. The suits then walked toward Daniel and addressed him by a different name, one that made Maya blink in confusion because it was not Daniel Cole. It was a name carrying weight, a name that sounded like it belonged to someone who lived in files with thick black redactions. Daniel responded with a small nod, showing respect but also familiarity. Maya saw the sergeant's face twist into shock, and the tall officer's jaw tighten as if he wished the night would fold itself up and disappear before anyone looked too closely at what they had done. The shorter suited man explained that Daniel was part of an active protective detail tied to an operation concerning a violent domestic group that had been planning an attack months earlier. Daniel had provided key intelligence that prevented tragedy, and because of that his identity had been sealed and rerouted through federal channels. The suit added that Daniel had been working under deep cover, and his appearance on that street was connected to a meeting with a contact who was supposed to come forward with crucial information. The tall officer felt his stomach sink as he realized his reckless arrest not only halted the meeting but possibly scared off the contact, entirely jeopardizing an operation bigger than anything this precinct handled. Maya's eyes widened with each revelation. Her instincts had been right from the first moment she saw Daniel standing in the rain. He did not move like someone hiding guilt. He moved like someone carrying heavy truth. She asked the suits if Daniel was in danger now, and they nodded, saying, "Danger is constant in work like his, but tonight, danger shifts depending on how quickly we correct this mistake." The commander tried to defend the station, saying his officers acted within their understanding, but the suits countered that understanding does not protect lives when judgment is clouded by impatience or pride. Daniel stood slowly and thanked the suits for arriving quickly. He told them he regretted making the call because he knew it drew attention he had tried to avoid, but the situation demanded action. He then turned to Maya and said quietly that she had been the only one in the room tonight who listened with intent. She felt a warmth rise behind her ribs because his words struck something honest and raw inside her. She had always believed policing meant paying attention before passing judgment, and tonight that belief had guided her through the fog of misunderstanding to a truth far greater than she imagined. The tall officer finally spoke, his voice low and defensive, saying they had followed protocol, based on suspicion, and that Daniel should understand officers face risks too. Daniel looked at him steadily and replied in that calm, unwavering tone that suspicion without evidence is not protection. It is fear dressed in authority, and fear can break more than it saves when left unchecked. The tall officer froze because those words hit deeper than any reprimand the commander could give. The suits instructed Maya to escort Daniel to the interview room not for questioning, but for safety, while they handled the necessary clearances. She walked beside him, feeling the gravity of each step and the weight of everything she had learned in the last hour. Daniel paused near the hallway and looked at the youth center flyer on the bulletin board, the same one Maya had noticed earlier. She saw his eyes soften just slightly, and she realized he recognized it. She asked if he knew the center, and he nodded, saying it was one of the few places that helped him stay grounded in the work he did. She wondered then if he was the anonymous donor, but she did not ask because the truth already spoke loud, enough without needing confirmation inside. The interview room, Daniel sat across from her, and the silence between them felt different now. Not heavy, not tense, but meaningful, like 2 points finally connected on a map. Maya asked him quietly why he remained so calm through everything, and he said calm is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to move through fear without letting it decide who you become. She looked at him and something inside her shifted forever because she knew she was witnessing a kind of strength that training could never teach the suits. Returned a few minutes later with new instructions, and the next phase of the night began to unfold, a phase where truths would rise, mistakes would surface, and the entire precinct would face the consequences of choices made in the rain. Maya braced herself because she knew the storm was not ending. It was only changing shape. The interview room felt warmer than the rest of the station, as if the air inside it carried all the leftover heat from the storm outside and all the tension from the people who had walked in and out of it tonight. Daniel sat with his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the table, and Maya stood near the door, not guarding him, but standing with him in a silent show of trust that she herself did not fully understand yet. She kept watching him, and every time he inhaled slowly, it felt like the whole room inhaled with him, as if his calm had begun to spill outward into the space. The suits had stepped out to speak with the commander, leaving the two of them inside a stillness that seemed alive with quiet meaning. Maya leaned her shoulder against the wall and studied Daniel's face, noticing how his eyes softened whenever they landed on something familiar, like the bulletin board outside or the slow ticking clock in the hallway. He carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and still managed to keep a gentle center inside himself, which only made her more curious about the life he lived before this night. Just as she was about to speak, the door opened again, and the two suited men entered, with a different kind of energy now, their steps quicker, their posture more direct, their expressions sharper than before. One of them closed the door behind him, but not all the way, as if leaving it partly open would help the tension escape the room before it pressed down on them too hard. They sat across from Daniel and exchanged a few glances before beginning to explain the depth of what had gone wrong tonight. They told him the contact he was supposed to meet had vanished the moment flashing lights hit the street, and that contact had been carrying crucial information involving a violent suspect whose name was tied to multiple ongoing cases across the state. The suits explained that losing that meeting might delay the operation by days, maybe weeks, and during those days people could be harmed because a dangerous individual now had room to disappear. Maya felt her chest tighten as she listened, because she realized now that what her partner had dismissed as a routine stop had been a moment with huge consequences, and every choice made since then had added layers of trouble that none of them were ready to face. Daniel listened without flinching as the suits explained that the federal team had been using his identity carefully for months, letting him move through certain neighborhoods unnoticed, because he looked like someone who belonged wherever he walked, and that allowed him to reach people most officers could never approach without raising alarm. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing every detail, and Maya saw that he did not blame anyone, even though he had every right to. His calm was not acceptance but responsibility, because he seemed like the kind of man who would rather carry pain quietly than hand it to someone else. The suits then turned to Maya and told her that her actions earlier had prevented the situation from becoming worse. They said her insistence on reviewing footage, her questions, and her refusal to let the case be rushed had kept Daniel from being transferred to county holding, where the risk to him would have been far greater. Maya felt heat rise in her throat, because she had acted only on instinct and duty, not expecting recognition or gratitude. But hearing those words made her realize how close the night had been to spiraling into danger for everyone involved. Daniel looked at her with a soft, grateful nod, and that nod said more than any speech could. It told her she had chosen truth even when it meant standing alone. The tall officer entered the room suddenly, and his face was stiff with a mixture of confusion and stubborn pride. He demanded to know why the suits were protecting a suspect and why the station was being told how to handle its own detainee. His voice trembled slightly, even though he tried to hide it, and the suits exchanged a slow, tired glance before they revealed the next piece of truth. They explained that Daniel was not a suspect, he was a protected witness under federal safeguarding, and the name he gave earlier belonged to a classification level. The tall officer had no clearance to view. The officer stepped back as if struck by a silent force because he realized his actions tonight were not just a mistake, but a breach, one that could bring formal investigation into the department. His face paled and his hands trembled because he saw the thin line between authority and accountability tightening around him. The suits pushed a small sealed envelope across the table toward the commander, who stood in the doorway watching everything with wide eyes. They explained that inside the envelope was the documentation, proving Daniel's clearance status, his sealed identity, and the record of his involvement in stopping a planned attack months earlier. Maya watched the commander's expression shift, from shock to shame as he realized that the man he had doubted, the man he had delayed, the man he had dismissed had risked his life to save countless others without ever asking for recognition. The room grew heavy with the weight of that realization, and silence moved through the air like a soft wave. Then came the moment that revealed a truth no one expected. The shorter-suited man explained that Daniel was also the unseen donor who had kept the Jackson Avenue Youth Center funded after the city budget cuts. He said Daniel had made sure the center stayed open on weekends so kids would have a safe place to go and families would have a support hub when they needed it. Maya's breath caught because she remembered the flyer she had seen earlier and how Daniel's eyes had softened when they stopped near it. The tall officer looked down at the floor, unable to meet Daniel's gaze because he realized he had arrested a man who had done more good for the community than half the precinct combined. As the truth settled into the room, Daniel spoke finally, and his voice was steady as always. He said he was not angry and he did not want anyone punished for mistakes made in exhaustion or fear. He said fear makes people rush, and rushing makes people blind, and tonight blindness had turned into misunderstanding. He asked the suits to let the precinct handle any internal corrections, so the community did not lose trust in their local officers, because rebuilding trust is harder than preventing harm. Maya felt something shift inside her chest because she had never met someone who suffered quietly, yet still protected those who wronged him. The suits agreed to Daniel's request and said they would leave the internal matters to the commander after Daniel was released. They also explained that the department could take credit for correcting the error, as long as they cleared Daniel quickly and updated the log before morning. The commander nodded vigorously because he knew the federal team was offering them a lifeline and he needed to pull the department back from the edge of scandal before sunrise. When the suit stepped out, Daniel stood slowly and looked at Maya with a calm, steady expression that held gratitude and truth. He told her that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is the quiet act of choosing to stand on the side of honesty, even when others push against it. Maya felt the words settle inside her like a seed ready to grow into something stronger than the fear she had been fighting all night. The tall officer walked out quietly, and the sergeant followed him with a look of worry because accountability had finally found its place in the room. Maya escorted Daniel out of the interview room and into the hallway where the night felt different now. Lighter, yet more meaningful. The station was no longer just a building with flickering lights and tired officers. It had become a place where truth had cracked open the dark and revealed the real measure of the people inside it. She walked beside Daniel, feeling a connection. She could not explain yet, a connection built on trust formed through a night of tension, mistakes, revelations, and choices that had shown them both who they really were beneath the uniforms and shadows. The hallway outside the interview room felt strangely hollow, as if the air had been holding too many secrets, and finally exhaled them all at once, leaving only the weight of truth behind. Daniel walked beside Maya with that same steady calm that had carried him through the long, tense hours of the night, and she could not stop glancing at him, trying to understand how a man who had been handcuffed in the rain could still move with The quiet strength of someone who forgives before he blames. The station lights flickered softly above them, not in warning but in exhaustion, as if the building itself had grown tired of carrying confusion and fear. Officers moved around them with stiff shoulders and uneasy glances, because everyone had realized by now that this night would follow them into their thoughts for a long time. Daniel paused near the property counter where his small tray sat with his wallet, his folded note, and his simple pen, all waiting like tiny pieces of a life that should never have been disrupted. The clerk stepped forward awkwardly and handed the items back with a stiff apology that Daniel accepted with a gentle nod. He unfolded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Before anyone could see the name written inside, Maya noticed how he handled it, not carelessly, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of someone who understood the weight of trust carried on a simple piece of paper. She wondered again who exactly he had called earlier, and what kind of connection could make federal agents rush into a precinct at midnight without hesitation. The suit stood by the front desk, going through the final clearance steps with the commander, who looked smaller than he had when the night began, as if the truth had pressed down on him until his pride cracked open at the seams. He kept apologizing in different ways, stumbling over sentences that tried to explain ignorance and exhaustion and bad judgment. The suits nodded politely, but their eyes stayed fixed on the task because tonight had revealed more flaws than excuses could cover, and their job was to secure Daniel, not soothe egos. The sergeant kept rubbing the back of his neck, muttering about paperwork and procedure, while the tall arresting officer stayed in the corner, staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes because he understood, finally, that his choices had placed more than one life in danger. When the suits asked for the body cam and dash cam footage, Maya stepped forward with the drive. The tall officer tried to protest, saying the footage needed internal review first, but Maya cut him off with a tone she had never used before, because she knew this was not the night to protect pride or hide mistakes. She handed the drive to the suits and explained that the footage would show Daniel calm, respectful, and compliant at every moment, and that the claims of suspicion made earlier did not match reality. She expected anger from her partner, but instead she saw something like shame flicker across his face, because even he understood the truth had finally conquered the night's confusion. The suits thanked her and began reviewing the dash cam footage on a secure tablet, their eyes narrowing as the video showed the rain falling across the windshield, the flashing reflections on the wet street, the tall officer approaching, Daniel with unnecessary tension in his stance, and Daniel responding with calm stillness that did not hint at any threat. Maya stood nearby, watching their reactions, and felt a mix of relief and frustration because the footage proved everything she had sensed earlier, yet none of it should have required federal intervention to be recognized. The suits then pulled the commander aside and explained that the arrest had jeopardized an active operation and that the contact Daniel was meant to meet might now require relocation and additional resources because fear spreads fast when flashing lights disrupt secret paths. The commander pressed his hands against his forehead and apologized again, promising to file internal corrections and mandatory retraining for the entire shift. Maya watched this with a quiet sense of justice, but also sadness, because it should not take a night like this for officers to remember the weight of their authority and the responsibility tied to every decision they make in the field. Daniel remained near the hallway, observing everything without bitterness. He carried himself like someone who had walked through far worse nights and learned long ago that anger wastes energy needed for survival and understanding. Maya walked over to him and asked if he was all right, not out of duty but out of genuine concern. He smiled slightly and said he was more concerned about her, because she had stood on the edge of a difficult choice tonight and chosen truth, even when it left her standing alone. She felt a warmth rise in her chest and looked away for a moment, because hearing those words from him made something inside her soften in a way she had not expected. One of the suits approached them and explained the final step of the night. They needed to retrieve the complete truth from the dash cam, including the buried audio that captured the moments just before the cuffs clicked and the video that would show clearly that Daniel had made no threatening moves. The suit opened the locker where the dash cam archive rested and connected a tablet to the system. Maya stood nearby as the footage loaded, and the tall officer hovered nervously behind them like someone waiting for a verdict that could shift his entire career. The screen lit up with the last few minutes before the arrest, the rain falling harder. Now the street looking like a sheet of dark glass reflecting the distant glow of streetlights. They watched the tall officer approach Daniel, with a hand resting near his holster even though Daniel stood still with his hands visible. They heard Daniel's voice, soft, calm, respectful, asking if everything was all right and offering any information needed to clear confusion. They heard the tall officer misread everything, not out of fear, but out of impatience and exhaustion, and maybe even bias, the kind that hides deep inside people and only reveals itself in small pressured moments. And then they saw the moment the cuffs
came out too fast, too tight, too unnecessary. The
suits exchanged a low whisper and turned to the commander, explaining that the video left no room for interpretation. The arrest was unjustified and the report would be updated immediately. The tall officer looked like he might collapse, and Maya felt a strange mix of pity and disappointment because she had worked with him for months and never imagined he would let frustration twist into an act that could cost so much. Daniel watched the officer with a gentle expression. Not triumph, not anger, just acceptance, as if he had seen many people stumble through their flaws before and understood that everyone carries shadows they do not always see, until someone shines a light on them. The suits finalized their report and prepared the release documents. They instructed the commander to notify internal affairs in the morning and to schedule mandatory corrective training for the entire unit. Maya felt a strange ache in her stomach, because she knew tomorrow would be difficult for everyone but necessary for the department to regain its integrity. She looked at Daniel one more time and saw that he was finally free to leave. But he did not move yet, as if he sensed unfinished meaning in the room. He walked toward the tall officer and stopped a few feet away. The entire station watched as Daniel spoke in a soft, steady voice, telling the officer that strength is not measured by who you control, but by what you choose to understand before acting. He said mistakes happen, but refusing to learn from them is what breaks people and breaks communities. The tall officer's eyes filled with something like regret, and he nodded slowly, unable to speak. Daniel turned back toward Maya and asked quietly if she would walk him out. She nodded without hesitation, and they stepped toward the double doors of the station, where the air outside smelled of rain, washed streets, and a quiet new beginning waiting to unfold. She felt a deep sense of connection to him now, not because of his hidden past or the secrets around him, but because he had shown her that truth still has power even on nights filled with fear, confusion, and authority pushed in the wrong direction. The night outside the station opened into a soft silver quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has given everything it had and now steps aside to let the world breathe again. Daniel walked out with Maya at his side, and the street glowed under a thin layer of rain that made every light stretch into long, gentle reflections. They moved slowly, not because they were unsure, but because the moment itself felt heavy with meaning, and neither of them wanted to rush what felt like the closing chapter of a night that had tested everyone inside the station. Maya kept glancing at Daniel, trying to understand how he carried so much gravity with such calm, how he walked through danger without letting anger twist his voice, how he held himself with a kind of quiet kindness that made people around him want to stand straighter and act better. Daniel breathed deeply, as if the fresh air was washing the tension out of his lungs, one slow rise and fall at a time. Behind them, the station lights hummed and flickered as officers whispered in worried circles, trying to understand how everything they believed about authority and procedure had shifted in the span of a few hours. The tall officer leaned against the wall inside, struggling with a guilt that would follow him for days, perhaps years, but also holding on to Daniel's words like a lantern in the dark, because somehow the calm man he had wronged had still offered him something like hope. The sergeant sat at his desk, rewriting the report line by line, trying to turn a night of confusion into a lesson the department would not forget. Even the commander walked slower than usual, because he now understood how thin the line between leadership and failure truly is when pride takes the wheel. Maya and Daniel walked toward the edge of the sidewalk where puddles shimmered like broken mirrors. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions about the sealed identity, the operation, the life he lived in shadows, but every time she tried to speak, her voice softened into silence, because she sensed that some truths are meant to remain quiet to keep people safe. Instead, she asked him the only question that felt honest and human. "Are you really all right?" Daniel smiled gently, the kind of smile that carried gratitude rather than triumph, and said he was all right, enough for tonight, and that what mattered more was that the truth had found its way into the room before the damage became permanent. A car approached slowly from the far end of the block, sleek, dark, quiet, and clearly meant for someone important. The suit stepped out of the station and gestured for Daniel to join them, explaining that they needed to take him to a secure location until the contact could be traced again. Daniel nodded and turned to Maya one last time. She felt something lift and tighten inside her. As he stepped closer, the soft streetlight outlining the edges of his calm face. He thanked her in a low voice for listening when others would not, for standing firm when it was difficult, and for choosing truth when fear could have taken her in another direction. He told her that courage is not the loud choice, it is the steady one, the one made in silence before anyone sees. Maya felt her chest warm with emotion because his words held weight that would stay with her for a long time. She wanted Ted to say that she had only done her job, but she could not speak that lie because deep down she knew she had gone against pressure and expectations to follow what felt right, not just what was written in protocol. Instead, she said she was glad he was going home safe, or at least safe enough for someone who lived in the kind of world he lived in, and he nodded as if he understood everything she left unsaid. The suits opened the car door and waited. Daniel looked back at the station for a moment, his eyes soft with something like sorrow and something like gratitude all mixed into one quiet expression. He told Maya that the city needs officers like her, officers who look before they judge, who listen before they act, who stand up even when they stand alone. She felt a tightness rise behind her eyes, but she blinked it away because she wanted to remember this moment with clarity, not blur it with emotion. Daniel stepped into the car, the door closing with a soft thud that felt like the final page of a long, heavy chapter turning itself over. The engine hummed and the car moved down the wet street until its taillights faded into the darkness, leaving Maya standing alone on the sidewalk with the night breeze brushing against her face and the soft glow of the streetlights above her. She looked at the station behind her, then at the empty road ahead, and felt something inside her shift, something steady and sure telling her that this night had changed her, not in a loud dramatic way, but in the quiet way people grow after. Seeing truth raw and unfiltered, she walked back inside, and the officers looked at her differently now, not as a rookie, not as someone still learning, but as someone who had stood firm in a storm and helped guide the truth toward the light. The commander nodded at her with a humility she had never seen in him before. The sergeant handed her the final report, asking her to review it because he trusted her judgment. And the tall officer whispered a quiet apology that she accepted with a calm nod, because forgiveness is a form of strength too. The station felt different now, not fixed, not perfect, but honest, and honesty gave it a chance to heal. As the night thinned into early morning, Maya stepped outside again and breathed deeply, feeling the cool air settle against her skin. She looked down the street where Daniel's car had vanished and whispered a quiet wish for his safety, knowing that his path would never be simple, but also knowing he carried the kind of calm strength that could survive storms most people never see. The city lights flickered softly and the wind lifted just enough to make the world feel new again, and somewhere, far in the distance, a man with a sealed identity and a quiet heart carried on with the work he never received credit for, work that kept people safe even when they never knew his name. The night closed behind him, the truth settled into its rightful place, and a precinct bruised by its own mistakes learned that strength is not power, it is compassion. Truth and the courage to do what is right when the world is watching and when it is not. The end.